Okay, so when I first wrote my story, my book, I had a fear of my mother reading it. I had a fear of it getting published and my mother would read it. And she would come across the 2 chapters in the book that I consider to be kind of dark. Okay, chapter 28 is one of those 2 chapters. So that's what I'm going to be reading now, is chapter 28. It's actually only 9 pages. And I have actually gone through and taken it down a few notches. I've taken out a lot of the description. So it's not nearly as graphic. I think I just kind of touch upon what is going on. So hopefully the reader, in my opinion, sometimes it's actually more effective to have less graphic description and just hint at what's going on and let the reader's imagination fill in the blanks. So that's what I tried to do with this chapter, but it is still pretty dark for anybody who has an imagination. It's not as dark as a lot of things I read, though. It's, you know, it doesn't compare to some of the shit that I have read. So, but for me as a writer, it's kind of dark. So just be warned. So here it is, chapter 28. Song of Mornius, chapter 28. Felrina trembled as she walked, her gaze fixed on the giant wrought floor. She had traveled this route often enough, but never like this, never noticing before how each stride brought her closer to the mountain's dead heart. The black rock of the tunnel amplified everything, from her father's harsh breathing to the catch and whimper in his throat. As they rounded a corner, torchlight flamed on his face, on the bright glare of sweat across his forehead. Felrina paused in the light to face him, scowling as his white-rimmed eyes met hers. She felt the pounding of his heart as she pushed him back into the darkness and out of sight from the nearby chamber. "Father," she whispered. "Smell." His gaze focused on the light ahead. "I know." His face was ashen. "Yes, I expected this." She nodded. The scent of hazelthorn was unmistakable. Seeker elves used it as medication, while Malian's priests administered it both as a mental stimulant and a way to prevent the sacrifice from bleeding profusely and dying too quickly. A soft chanting filled the chamber. She knew the words by rote, the beckoning inflections behind each carefully spoken syllable. Without a word, she pressed Nithra back. "They mean to sacrifice you," she whispered harshly into his ear. "Father, come. I know a way out. A natural tunnel not far from here. Come." Nithra, his hands awkward, patted her shoulder. His head was up, his lips taut over his teeth. "He'll know, my daughter, and he'll find us. You can't hide from a warder. No matter what we do, I'll end up paying for what I've done. I had the staff and lost it. I deserve this." Felrina held him fiercely, embracing him. "No!" She panted the words against his chest, directly to his heart. "You only followed Malian because of me, to stay with me. I can't let them kill you." "Felrina," Nithra said softly, "be silent. Malian hears you. Don't be a fool, or you'll be next. Let me go." He shoved past her, his focus on the chamber's lighted entrance. Hands trembling visibly, he thrust himself forward. She hurried to block his path. "Father, no!" His fingers brushed her cheek, traced the curve of her eyebrows, the lines of worry on her forehead. For a moment his eyes watered. She watched as he appeared to look inward at himself. Then he winced at what he saw. "My child." His hands reached to hold her tight. "It's not too late for you. My child, listen." He broke off and grabbed at his throat, his mouth working. Soundlessly he stumbled back to be grabbed by hands reaching from a smudge of blackness behind him. "Malian awaits!" Methan Mens hissed into his ear. Turning, the black robe lifted him bodily toward the chamber. "You've destroyed my army," Mens snarled. "Half my best fighters. For that you die slow." "Mens!" Felrina followed. throwing herself at Meth and Men's back. Men's, no! Please! He's my father! Men's! He threw her a savage grin over his shoulder. Oh, but I will do it, priestess, or Malian will. This fool had the staff. All of this could have been over. Oh, believe me, he will pay. He made a mistake! Felrina sank to her knees. A swirl of gray robes choked the hall. With eager hands they lifted her father, immobilized him with magic and words. His face went red as he fought to move, to control his body even enough to look at her. Father! She whispered his name, watching the horde carry him in. In a daze, Felrina climbed to her feet. Slowly she followed through the low entrance and stopped. Already the attendants lifted him to the altar. Grimly they caught at his flailing limbs, stretched him out along the stone. Behind and above the altar a blackness crouched, a glimpse of night sky huddled beneath the mountain. You see, Malian, Men said, standing beside her. At any other time she would have reacted to his proximity, to the warped heat radiating off his skin, but not now. Though he stood close enough that his arm touched hers, she ignored him. A fist squeezed her heart. Her face was warm, damp with tears, and all she could see was her father. Nithra writhed and twisted as the attendant stripped him. Then slowly the blackness lifted and fell. Like a cloak of midnight, Malian spread himself across the altar, wrapping limbs of black shadow around her father and hugging him close. Nithra stiffened in the arms of his god, then screamed. Malian wants it done his way, Men's explained softly. He caught her shoulder, restraining her as she fought to pull away. Across the chamber, Nithra pleaded and sobbed. His cries were muffled by a soft hissing sound, distant. Again and again the shadow flexed around his body, then finally relaxed and slid to the floor. Nithra yelped as the lead attendant's knife pierced the back of his scalp. A trickle of blood ran from his head down the side of the altar. Malian has consumed the connective tissue under the skin, Men said from beside her. The rest should be easy, with the attendant's help, of course. The rest? Felrina, trembling, stared at her father. Blood spattered as his head was carefully lifted. Grim-faced, the lead attendant poured a measure of hazelthorn down his throat. Malian watches you closely, Felrina, Men's told her. You'll be next, if even once you look away. She had no choice. A force held her, gripping her where she stood. In helpless silence she watched as the blackness rose slowly from the floor, a thin tendril of midnight languidly lifting to touch the balls of Nithra's 2 feet. Nithra stiffened as at once the skin along his ankles pulled from his bones, stretching longer as Malian tugged rhythmically. Then he thrashed against his bonds, his eyes gaping at the ceiling. Down the entire length of his body his skin pulled tight. It seemed to stretch to the point of tearing. Then Felrina saw it move, creeping ever so slowly downward toward his feet. At the same time she saw the cut widen behind his head, stretching back from red muscle. Felrina cried out. At her side Men's chuckled, his hands lifted to his lips. See, Felrina? Men's flicked her a glance. Malian demonstrates how he devours the stars. Through her tears Felrina continued to stare, her sobs catching in her throat. The edges of her father's wound yawned open, exposing the glistening dome of his skull. Slowly his hairline crept down over his face, over his forehead and eyes. His screams were muffled, his mouth covered by skin. I've seen this before, Men's was saying. Malian strips the bones, but he does it carefully. The skin is taken first, then the muscle. Felrina sank to her knees and retched. Between her sour spasms she saw her father's face as it used to be, his happy grin as he swept her up with his hands and swung her around. She was his only child, his only joy after her mother's death. She had trailed like a puppy behind him always, making herself filthy in the soil he used to farm. Now he lay writhing, his back arched, heels pressed to the stone. His face was a crossing of veins, tendon, and muscle, a lipless mouth stretched in an unending scream. Standing, Filrina threw herself at Mens. "Kill him!" she screamed. "Finish it!" Brows raised, he pushed her back. "I wish I could, Filrina," he said with feigned sadness, "but this is Melian's will." Breathing hard, she turned toward the altar. Held by power turned against her, she had no choice but to keep her eyes open. Yet her mind spiraled inward. She was a child again, romping beside the river, or in it up to her knees, searching for leapers. Tarek the boy hunted in the swirling water with her, with Cameron watching wide-eyed from the bank, and her father, on the bank, keeping watch on her as he always did, chopping more kindling for the fire. More noises from her past, smells of moss and crushed loam. She inhaled it, savored it. A scream jerked her to the present. Her father no longer looked human. He lay with his spine twisted, body glistening like a silk bug ripped from its cocoon. A tendril of scalp still clung to one toe, stretching thin as Melian devoured it. Mens leaned forward, his eyes bright as his fingers formed claws. "Now," he whispered. Filrina nodded. She wanted it to end, wanted it over. Trembling, she watched Melian's darkness spreading itself again over her father's body, threads of it twisting its way through his muscles and bones. Arching his neck, Nithra screamed. She roused to the sound of weeping, of soft cries from her own throat. Across from her bed sat Mens, bracing his staff between his knees. "Not fair, Filrina," said Mens. "You weren't supposed to faint." She held her stomach, gripping her nausea with both hands. "You bastard," she whispered. "How could you? How could Melian? After all I've done." "Shh," Mens hissed. "Melian will only tolerate so much of your insubordination, Filrina. You are his eyes and ears, remember. He still hears and knows your every word." "Then let him know this!" She flung back her head to glare at the ceiling. At once Mens seized her shoulders, shaking her hard. "Stop it!" Mens hovered close, his hands pressing against her brow, pushing her head to her pillow. "Fool! Or do you want him doing that to you? He would, you know. This kind of death strengthens him greatly. After your father, he took 3 more the same way." "And you let him?" "He's not supposed to touch the world, Mens." Filrina fought to sit up and then collapsed, trembling. "I'm going to be sick," she whispered. With tentative fingers, she examined herself, the bruises on her wrists and ankles. "Why do I hurt inside?" With a sudden blind fury, she thrust at Mens. "Why do I hurt, Mens?" Seizing her arms, Meth and Mens pressed them above her head. "It was your punishment, I'm afraid, for bad behavior. And if you don't behave now, he'll let me do it again." With his free hand, he reached inside the generous sleeve of her robe. "I could," he said, "and Melian would let me." He paused, scrubbing his chin with the side of his wrist. "I had no idea you were a virgin." "Bastard!" Tears streamed her face as she weakly moved her hips in pain. Now again she tasted vomit. With effort she choked it down. "You took me! You—" He nodded. "Several times." Leaning forward, he locked her arms over her head with a soft word of magic. Then he sat back, immobilizing her legs. "Just like that," he said, standing. "Old magic." Closing her eyes, she turned her head. "I loved you," she gritted fiercely. "I talked my father into this for you. Now Melian has taken him from me, taken everyone I cared about, Cameron, Tarek, and I helped him. I helped him do it." Mens glared down, his face lost in shadows and thought. "You can't judge him based on how he seems, Filrina. We've never seen him as he really is. On this world he is limited in his power. Even the old magic is stronger, or at least its potential. You've never—" "I don't want to!" Filrina snapped. "I've seen what it's done to you, what the old magic has done. I remember when you first came to Kitterin. You were so young and nice to me. You told me all these great things I could be, how I could make a difference, make things better. I left behind everything for your promises, Mens. I left behind my life for your god." "Your god, too, remember?" he said. He moved to where her blazing stone staff leaned against the wall and touched it reverently. "Your father never served Malian, and you know it." Filrina closed her eyes as again he approached, turned her head with a sob as he loosened her robe and slowly uncovered her. "There now," he whispered, leaning over. She groaned as he nibbled with his teeth at her neck. "So much better." He paused, then, glancing down, ran his fingers lightly over her ribs. "Malian has given you into my keeping for the day, Filrina. I may as well have some fun." With a shuddering breath, Filrina closed her eyes. She struggled to think without Malian hearing her. Malian was feeding on her now, her grief and anguish and loss. There was no way she could possibly block him. She gritted her teeth as Mens ground himself against her hips. She would find a way.